The greatest thing from Quebec since Celine Dion and GSP.
A pair of siblings.
A couple of stellar young men.
Two brothers.
These two young men.
Two siblings.
The hard-hitting pair represent Canada.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed the new intro. Welcome to Thinkin Bros. My name is Chris.
And I'm Alex.
We're your favorite corner store philosophers trying to figure out life one conundrum at a time. And today we're going to be talking about, well, it feels like it's my birthday because we're talking about an anti-psychology paper by a guy who dabbles in statistics, Tal Yarkoni, Generalizability Crisis. But before that, we're going to be talking about Zen Buddhism and Alan Watts' The Way of Zen.
Doesn't he have a pronunciation guide? Why'd you say it like that?
Right. Forgot. So the chapter we read in The Way of Zen is about, well, it's called Sitting Quietly Doing Nothing. But I feel like it's more about spontaneity, essentially, and harnessing spontaneity, which I feel like is a pretty important thing in our day. Because I do think people overthink stuff a lot and they're in their head a lot, but not enough to where I can have an intelligent conversation with them. So I feel like if they could redirect their thoughts from like anxious thoughts of like, oh, does this person like me, or should I be doing this, to more like, is killing inherently bad or something, it'd be cool. But it doesn't matter. So here it essentially says, I guess, how to reach spontaneity. But of course, as is mentioned, it's very hard to teach something like that because it's kind of there are a lot of ironies and a lot of paradoxes in here. And one of the examples he gives is, it's as if when you're told that spontaneity can, save you from all this anxiety and stuff, it's as if I gave you medicine and said, oh, by the way, it'll only work if you don't think about the monkey.
Mm-hmm.
So just don't think about the monkey.
Well, he says that in the book too, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I said.
yeah, okay.
So it's kind of funny because, like, don't think about the blue elephant. How are you going to do that? And he essentially goes into how you would go about doing that. So we're going to try to explain it. But again, one thing to understand about Alan Watts is he explains Buddhism, and it's so foreign to where are we?
West.
Western societies that he says this at the beginning of the book. Buddhism cannot be explained in any positive terms. So what this means is essentially he can tell you what it's not. So he tells you, extensively what it's not. And it feels like a weird approach, but it's okay because has very good metaphors, has very good stories and examples.
It does feel like reading it, it does feel like the only way to get at it is through like negative terms and not saying stuff, because the end state, right, is sort of like transcendence that only few people reach. And if you want to describe something like that, if you want to describe something that,
like how to reach nirvana.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Is Alan Watts a Buddha?
No, I don't think he pretends to be a Buddha, but
Okay, but yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't think he was a Buddha, but exactly. It's like he hasn't attained it, so he doesn't really know what he's talking about, but he understands it probably better than most everyone. And you really get at something that you haven't attained, and that's really hard to attain, and that's elusive through sort of these negations.
The thing too about like understanding, you use the word understanding. You have to understand that even the most developed Buddhist monk is never gonna dare say, oh, I understand, or I have reached. Like that's an intermediary mistake that you would make, where you don't actually understand what it means. Because the ultimate point of Zen Buddhism, as I understand it, is that there was never anything to learn from it, right?
Yeah.
Like, we have this whole podcast about morality, about love, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, life is just going to keep going. And especially in 100 years, none of it is going to matter. Everything is going to burn and whatever.
So the masters are Yeah, I forgot. The masters are decided by the students, right? It's just
Exactly.
people go see someone that seems to have attained it, but he doesn't claim to have attained it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it may be the recency effect because I just reviewed this, but the opening of the chapter is my favorite part because he recounts how some students heard about a master just crying about the death of his relative or something, right? And they were like, well, isn't this supposed to be aren't we supposed to be kind of stoic and, be like on a deeper level and not react to these things? And then the master says, don't be stupid. I was crying because I wanted to cry, not because my relative died. I cried because I wanted to cry. And in the beginning, you're like, oh, this is some like Zen Buddhist trickery that it's like, oh, he's kind of spinning off like, oh, semantics, but I think it's extremely deep. There's another story of a Zen master that, experienced some grief also and just shouted at the top of his lungs, right? And then he contrasts it with a story about, I think, two monks that let themselves be burned without reacting. Like they were in a meditative state and they let themselves be burned for a certain cause or a village. And I think the beginner student didn't understand how could those two situations happen by a real master. How can one be completely stoic, I mean inhumanly stoic, one being burned, and then also at the same time it can be a right thing to do for a master to cry about the death of his relative. So the answer to that,
go ahead.
The answer to that is the saying that goes
a bit like this.
In walking, just walk. In sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble. This is really interesting because he also says, my first instinct is to understand it like the way he's going to describe it here. I think he says that's not the way to interpret it. It would be quite wrong to suppose that this natural sincerity comes about by observing such a platitude as whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. When Yen Tu screamed, he was not screaming in order to be natural, nor did he first make up his mind to scream and then implement the decision with the full energy of his will. Okay. This is just about how you attain spontaneity, and he's saying that if you're intentional in attaining spontaneity, it's never going to work because that's the paradox, right?
Yeah, it's a recurring theme, and it seems like in some ways, not a lot of people like read about Zen Buddhism, but at the same time, I feel like it's a popular goal to attain, to be spontaneous and to be yourself still in the West. And I feel like that's a mistake a lot of people make. When someone is trying to be spontaneous and be themselves, oftentimes it feels like they're trying to display that they are that way and not actually be that way. Because it's cool to be spontaneous and they want to display that. But it's hard to actually be spontaneous because some of the things you want to do sometimes aren't socially acceptable. And, it's a big deal to like,
yeah. Do you think it's important to be spontaneous if you do decide to take that path, right? Which again, even using the language decide to take that path isn't really correct, but whatever. Do you think it's important to always be so? Because if you think about some people we may know from high school, people / objects, which were always spontaneous, right? But to a point where it doesn't matter the consequence, right? Whatever thought goes through his head, he's gonna say it. If it ends up with like in a conversation between him and the principal, that's what's gonna happen. If it ends up making the whole class laugh and the teacher laugh, that's what's gonna happen, right? So no matter the reward. So now imagine me, right, who's more, has more filters before whatever is in my brain reaches my mouth. If I were to decide to take that path, it feels like I couldn't really allow myself to only be spontaneous when it's like not that risky for me, right? You have to go all the way. That's the thing. It has to be holistic. It feels like.
Yeah. I should know this. I saw it in my class, but he says at some point that he sort of characterizes Buddhism as not a religion, or Zen is not a religion.
A way of salvation.
Sort of like it's higher than religion. It's the goal of religion, right?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, and maybe we can talk about that. But he says that it was, created and implemented as a solution to some movement in the East. Do you remember?
Like, I know it's about like social Confucianism or...
Exactly, Confucianism. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. And Confucianism is all about like social coherence and everything being according to the
I think
social
you mean
rules.
cohesiveness, right?
Yeah. Coherence doesn't mean anything
I
there.
don't
Yeah. Social cohesiveness and everyone getting along and all the rules being followed, and it's all about paying respect to your parents and to your elders, and a lot of rules. And then Zen comes along as a solution to that. But this is why I thought of this. Don't you think that people within Confucianism have already internalized these rules about respect your elders, about all these things? And this is the reason why they can be spontaneous, because their spontaneity is channeled in a way, is channeled in a socially acceptable way. And, as much as they will break social rules, because spontaneity, I think, entails that, their energy is directed in like sort of a productive way already. And that's why you can do it. Because it does seem like when I think of high school friends, who I think of not as objects but as people, their spontaneity sometimes was unjustified and just counterproductive.
Yeah, but I feel like it's part of life, right? Like higher risk, higher reward in that sense, right? If they were probably the funniest in the class because they allowed themselves to say the most outrageous things.
Yeah, but once again, like being funny is not the goal. Being yourself is the goal. And then also what I said is wrong, because being successful at school and not getting kicked out of school is not a goal. The goal is being spontaneous, right? And so they attain the goal no matter what. We're sort of always intuitively passing it through the filters of, is he staying in school? Is he going to have a good career? Is he going to be socially accepted? It doesn't matter. In Buddhism, the goal is not that. The goal is living life as it is. And
well, yeah, but on a philosophical level, and something we can all get behind, I feel like it definitely factors into authenticity, right? That's the biggest thing. If you're spontaneous, well, whatever your mind automatically generates is what you're gonna like put out into this world, which I definitely think to a certain extent is pretty cool. But here's the kicker, right? I feel like we're trying to take a different pathway to spontaneity, or
who's we?
Like Westerners, because what we're trying to do is think everything through a lot, right? And our hope with time, and let's say, yeah, we've done this introspection, we've chosen something that is our decision, right? And our hope with time is to simply get faster at identifying what we are, correct? That's how you find the self, right? You introspect your way into being like, okay, what I do, what is me, what is blah, blah, blah.
Within Buddhism, that sounds horrible.
Exactly.
Being faster at finding what you are. It's not finding what you are.
No, but here's the thing. They take the other way around, right? They're saying you have to absolutely not think, right? The master can try to throw off a student by asking, does the water in the drain turn clockwise or counterclockwise? And then punish the student if they stop to think, right? You have to give an answer. Them. Like a master will, when asked what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism, he'll say dumpling, and that's considered a good answer, like a masterful answer. And I understand that, but if this is what they're ultimately aspiring to, I feel like this is where we can kind of encounter the roadblock as Westerners of looking like, of seeing this idea of Buddhism and where it leads us to kind of only applying to the, living in the mountains, meditating 8 hours a day kind of monk mode, right? And this is like, that's not what we want from it, right?
Westerners? Yeah, but I think
this is not like what we want to extract from this book, essentially, is what I'm saying.
I think that's the problem. That's our problem, though, is that we don't want to extract that. I think I see what you're saying, and it only applies to the meditating 8 hours a day in the mountains, but it also applies, to something a bit more productive, as we like to say. like just someone living maybe alone, maybe with their family, chopping wood all day, and that's meditative for them. And they're doing something, they're chopping wood. And then you get closer, it's someone just doing their job however they want. And I feel like that could also go into Buddhism, because that's what they want to do. But I think what it defies and what it challenges is, let's say when you're becoming a psychologist, you could be like a licensed psychologist, and that takes a doctorate. Or you could be a therapist who does the same thing. Well, there's some things a psychologist does that a therapist can't do. You can become a therapist with like a master's degree, which takes a lot less time, but earns you a lot less money. But as a Buddhist, if the thing you ultimately want to do is help people and get, them talking about their problems and get through the problems, what's the difference really? You can be like more productive sort of by being a therapist, because you become one faster.
What's your point? Because ultimately what I wanted to determine from the very beginning is, can you half-ass, pardon the expression, being spontaneous? And we kind of determined that no, right? You have to go all the way. It's like, yeah, I understand there's some social filters that are going to be ingrained into your very spontaneity, right? So obviously this book doesn't even consider the instinct, how our instincts are shaped by our environment, but whatever. But if you can't halfway it, even being a therapist, right, and trying to be spontaneous, you could say some horrible things to a client. If you want to commit to spontaneity, you could say the most horrible license-ending thing to a client whenever, and you can't protect yourself against that, because if your goal is to be spontaneous, well...
Yeah, my point with that was more like, then perhaps it could be argued that, going for that PhD and wanting to be a psychologist is about the ego, about the money, about stuff. If ultimately what you want to do is help people, you should do the thing that helps you help the most people during your life, I guess. And that's an illusion that it breaks, of like money and status. Like, that doesn't matter. If what you want to do is just have a family, then that's what you should do. But what you're saying, yeah, brings about a point which I thought about while reading it, is I feel like spontaneity would work, because I have an optimistic conception of human nature. I feel like people are good, are basically good, and if they are spontaneous, what they would do is good things and pro-social things and help people. But if someone has an idea of human nature that's negative and thinks that some people are just bad, not because of their environment, not because of modification, they're just born, and well, I don't know, they're just bad. And if they let their mind roam free and their actions roam free, they would do bad things that are bad for society, then it does seem undesirable to be spontaneous.
Yeah, well, this doesn't really matter. I mean, this is a personal quest, and whoever's listening to this can, go on that personal quest for themselves if that's what interests them. I'm not saying our goal here is to determine if this is a generalizable concept. No spoiler for our next topic, but and I also still to this day I don't understand your point about therapists. I actually don't understand, but I think it touches an interesting concept about dividing the mind. And this is something we've gone through in our classes recently, right? The mind is the eye that sees but can't see itself. And what we often try to do, this is a Stoic metaphor, right? Life is like you're a dog chained to a
cart rolling down a hill.
Rolling down a hill, and you can try to resist it, and you're going to struggle a lot. Or you can kind of run with the cart and let life carry you where it may. Now, this I think it's important that the dog is running, because I don't want that to look like I'm encouraging inaction, right? Letting life carry you, or going with the flow. Only dead fish go with the flow. That's not what I'm encouraging. Ultimately, there is something about... So he says, if you try to resist... actually, let me read this passage, because I feel like this passage is interesting, because I feel like it's not written by a Zen master. Because
right? He's not a Zen master.
Huh?
Well, he's not a Zen master. So.
Who?
Oh, he quotes a Zen master, but you feel like it wouldn't be.
So many people, yeah. But it's just weird, because he gives the answer too clearly.
Okay.
Like that's what it is. Okay. A layman asks, I appreciate very much your instruction to the master. Instruction about the unborn, but by force of habit, second thoughts keep tending to arise, and being confused by them, it is difficult to be in perfect accord with the unborn. How am I to trust in it entirely? Bankei said, if you make an attempt to stop the second thoughts which arise, then the mind which does the stopping and the mind which is stopped become divided, and there is no occasion for peace of mind. So it is best for you to simply believe that originally there is no second thoughts. Yet, because of karmic affinity, through what you see and what you hear, these thoughts arise and vanish temporarily, but are without substance. Brushing off thoughts which arise is just like washing off blood with blood. We remain impure because of being washed with blood, even when the blood that was first there is gone.
Yeah, he could have just looked at the guy in the eye and said parallelogram, you know.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. Well, it was way too clear. So this is, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking like they give clear answers like that to beginners, and that guy was in an earlier stage, so he needed more help. And then to people that are close, they start like going crazy and being like, yo, dumpling, just to make them realize because they're more likely to realize. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. With students, you actually have to wear them down so they actually understand that there was nothing to understand. So that's a whole process. But this happens more often, than I initially thought. There's a book that people are mad about because apparently the guy spells out too clearly what it is to what Buddhism is, and it's I think Buddhist master. It's Master Shogun's, Master something Shobogenzo. So anyway, that is definitely interesting. I think if we were to integrate any concept, it would be not clinging. This is what I see. Another very related metaphor that Alan Watts uses, just as the dog, is that when you're a baby, you're just like pushed from a cliff from the beginning of life, and you can try to struggle to, cling onto the rocks that are falling with you, the boulders, and try to get some temporary safety by holding onto them, but ultimately is absolutely not going to do anything. And this is also pretty much what Satori is, and it's one-pointedness of mind. It's not questioning your own mind, not clinging, and not trying to divide something that wasn't made to be divided. Although I just recently finished a podcast by Andrew Huberman, and he said that we can have up to 3 spotlights of awareness. But apparently it feels very right that that's not how you should handle things, right? I just feel like there's something very attractive in oneness of mind.
Well, I think the most important thing to take out from that is that saying that a thought that comes is a second thought is completely an illusion. It's not a second thought. It's a thought that comes to your mind. What do you mean a second thought? There are no second thoughts. Everything that you think, and that's the way it is. It's like in mindfulness meditation, what you have to do is you concentrate on one thing, and then when thoughts come, you don't fight them. When, let's say, I have a tingle in my toe, what they say is like, think about the tingle in your toe. How does that feel? It's not like, oh, a pain, an extraneous thing, like an extra thing that's there. It's just like something's happening to my body, something's happening to my mind. Concentrate on it. That's an element of your mind. And then the river of your thoughts, as James says, is just carries it away, and that's it. Everything is, I guess, if it's in your mind, then it's not a second thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think to beginners, dividing the mind, and what is recommended is pure action, right? Just act. Then he says, but you know what? Thinking is also acting. So you can also think, don't worry about that. And just at the beginning, just be careful and don't think about thinking. That's dangerous. But thinking about thinking is also an action. So when you get the concept, you can think about thinking, and you can think about thinking about thinking. That's all good, right? But it doesn't divide the mind as long as you've developed oneness. And again, I feel like we've devolved into metaphors. I would love for this to take a more concrete turn and more practical. So let's say you have anxiety, right? Or you're worried about something that's upcoming. Recently, that's kind of happened to me. I feel like I tried to rationalize it all I could, but I don't know. It still didn't eliminate the thoughts, but I haven't gotten good at this. You just have to realize that your apprehension of a situation is actually always going to be worse than this situation is going to be. And I feel like that's easy to say, because even that thought, no matter how true I knew that was, it still didn't help me in that moment. So that's definitely something to consider. So essentially, the pathway to being okay. So yeah, let's try to say why one should be attracted to the idea of being spontaneous, and then how we think we understand to reach it from what we've read.
Is that like the ending of our discussion?
I would say, unless you have more.
Yeah, I have more. I wanted to talk about because I found it really interesting that, you know, you shouldn't think of Zen Buddhism as a religion. You know, religion has to do with morality and sort of spirituality, but he says Zen Buddhism is not about that. Zen Buddhism is the end goal of all religions, is the end goal of all political systems, is the end goal of all our efforts to be happy or whatever we want to be in an optimal state.
I don't remember him being this pretentious, but if you remember saying that, yeah.
He says that about religion. I don't know if he says that about politics. But, okay. Anyway, there are other things that I just didn't understand. Maybe you can elucidate if you understand it better. On page 146, I think it's at the top, when the student turns away and then the master calls them and they say yes, and the master says, there it is. I just didn't understand at all what that meant.
Okay, one stops trying to be spontaneous by seeing that it is unnecessary to try, and then there it can happen. The Zen masters often bring out this state by the device of evading a question, and then, as the questioner turns to go, calling him suddenly by name. As he naturally replies, yes, the master exclaims, there it is. To the Western reader, it may seem that all this is kind of a pantheism, an attempt to wipe out conflicts by asserting that everything is God. Yeah, I think I think I can understand it, because if you imagine yourself deeply in that process of you asked the complex question, right? Then you were denied. I feel like due to the cognitive load that would take, your mind would go down to a state, to a more automatic state, to take a break. You're turning, right? You're kind of just in the moment of doing that. And then, as the master calls your name or whatever, you don't think before saying the yes. You would do it instinctively. You'd be in the awareness that someone just had a conversation with you. It would come as a reflex, the yes as you turn, right? You wouldn't have planned it, but you planned the question, right? You planned, okay, what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism? And then when that chapter is over, your reflexes come back.
Mm-hmm.
And then so the master is kind of proud of like, okay, he's back. Because that's what Buddhism is ultimately, right? When you realize there's nothing to realize, when you don't question anything, when whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of like positive reinforcement whenever the student does something the master wants them to do. You know, they come with as an intellectual and trying to figure out life and trying to, figure out what the goal is. And the only moments a master smiles or laughs, right? There's a lot of passages about masters laughing when, I don't know if you showed me this, just like someone asks a master, what's the goal of life? And then the master shows a flower, and then one student in the back like grins or something,
right.
And then the master is like, you're the next one, right?
Yeah.
And
no, that's
just
from from one of his podcasts. I definitely said that story, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to say is he actually references psychoanalysis like on his own, but I made the link with Jung by myself. Is Jung's whole thing is that the ego, which is our conception of ourselves, which is limited, is sort of encompassed by the self. And the self is the totality of what we think we are, but also all our unconscious thoughts that are there in the background. And the process of life and the process that leads us to mental clarity and healthiness is the individuation process of the ego sort of becoming the self and starting to fill that space and integrating all the unconscious things, what he called the shadow, all that you think are your dark parts or something, but that are all part of yourself and that you sort of can't deny. And that's the process to be healthy. And I think that's like sort of, there's an exact parallel between that and these second thoughts. The second thoughts are not second thoughts. They're in you for a reason. You should, accept them for what they are, let them go or keep them, let them do whatever they want. And there's sort of a parallel there.
100%. Yeah. It's always, I think the most valuable thing to get out of this is understanding that, not abolishing, but getting into this meditative state where thoughts don't bother you, defeating anxiety, right? Reaching the Zen status, whatever that means, right? All of these things, the way we think we have to get to them is probably not the way to get to them. It must be counterintuitive because it is so hard. And the counterintuitive thing is to not fight with them, not deny them, right? And not necessarily accept them, but reframe them as something that comes from us. So it's not outside. It's not like also like, oh, this is not me. Well, look, it did come from your mind, so it is you, but it's just an effect of the dharma or whatever he says, right? It's just, it comes from within you and you have to kind of embrace it, not to, use cheesy Western terminology, but still. And you have to just let them go, brush them off, not wash off blood with blood, not fight thoughts with thoughts.
It's not cringy, actually, if you think of embrace not as like, just like as a hug.
Yeah.
You embrace them.
Yeah, no, 100%. Just like, yeah, accept that this is something that happens to you and go through it. Just walk. I think there's literally a quote that says, keep on walking forward or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
much less cheesy and less Instagrammable. But yeah, just a lot of beautiful stories. I guess that kind of concludes the how one would reach it part. And then the why. Well, this is interesting because I'm an intellectual, not in the good sense of the word, just in the neutral one. And I intellectualize everything, but this Zen kind of thinking and this, not everything has a reason to be, or, learning to enjoy walks just for what they are, or autotelism, which is just the enjoyment of an action for its own purpose and not for some other, productivity purpose. All of these things, those are the appeal. And I think for me, the reason I like Zen Buddhism is because it's kind of the antithesis of my past hyper-intellectual life and view of life. And I'm sure a lot of people share this thought because from a very young age, we're taught to, question everything, blah, blah, blah. It's good on a societal level, but like on a personal level, I don't know. One of the best things that has been confirmed by this book for me is everything goes through this pattern. It's okay. Then if you want to reach the ultimate, it's okay, right? Like level 3 that we talk about, you have to go through a phase where it's definitely not okay, right? It always gets worse before it gets better. And this is what it is, right? You have to kind of let the thoughts in. That's the thing. You can't block anymore. To not cling and to not be bothered by those thoughts, there's a phase where you have to live with them before you can live with them still, but in a way where they're not bothering you.
Yeah, and I think as they bother you less and less, they start not being there anymore. Also, right? When
yeah, and I think that's what it is. But the beauty of that is,
if they're
even
still
if
there,
they're there in the same number, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it. I think that pattern repeats itself across a lot of things. And the scary thing is always, if I want to get better, I have to put myself in a situation where I'm worse before that. So that's very interesting. And the upcoming blog is kind of about that. So free self-promotion. So is that it?
Yeah, I think why you want to attain that state simply is just, I think we've all been, if not in that exact state, in something that resembles it. I think of yesterday, before an exam, I just took a walk. I went outside and took a walk, and you just look at the snow, and I look like at people crossing me. I just look at their faces, and I don't know. Like, I just look at their faces, I admire their humanity, and just like, oh shit, like life is beautiful. You know, there's snow.
Oh, that was weird. Let's move on. No, but I get it, dude.
Where you're
I
just
get it.
in the moment, or I think people have an activity. For me, it's when I'm playing sports where you're not having those second thoughts, and if you do have those second thoughts, you know, it's easy to brush them off because you're in the moment. You're just doing the thing. Zen Buddhism, doing the thing.
The flow state. You're like, imagine permanent flow state. That's incredible. I think
How productive you would be.
how much money could I make? But this is the thing. If you think about every big decision that you have to, all right, I've gone through the last weeks. So for like 2 weeks, we knew this was gonna be what we read. I think, we did, and I repeated to myself whenever I had a difficult decision to make. It happened like twice. In standing, just stand, and sitting, just sit. But whatever you do, don't wobble. And that has genuinely helped me. Because when you look, like, this is a homework for everyone listening. If you think back at every difficult decision you've had to make, move to this country or stay with this person, right? Or choose this school or this school where all your friends are, but the other one has the program or whatever. Right now, it feels so trivial that whatever decision you made was the right one. But even if it wasn't, you just made it, right? Like, the difference between these decisions before we get to them seems so monumental. And the day after they're made, right? The day after, like, you step that foot into that new school, nothing matters anymore. Okay, well, this is the environment I'm in. I think, that it comes from the amazing human capacity to adapt to every environment. Like, when I went to a farm for 2 days, I forgot my routine here. I forgot what I was doing in the morning because now my life was that. And it took 2 days. Well, I have a horrible memory, so it definitely helps to adapt to new environments a lot. Like, after a week of not being in this house, I would have no idea what I did in this house, right? So
that resonates with me. I think you make me think of like my dislike for counterfactual thinking and regretting things.
Yeah.
Is just once you make a decision and you go in one way, I don't even know if it was probably right to stress about the decision a bit and weigh the pros and cons. But when two decisions are very similar in appealingness, right? And there's good things on both sides, you don't wobble. You choose to move out of the country, and you don't think about what your life could have been otherwise. I don't think we're naturally predisposed to that anyway. As you said, like, we have a natural ability to adapt to environments, and when you choose one path, you're bringing that into reality. You're making that reality, and the other path simply doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like it.
Well, as soon as you pass that point, it's counterfactual to think about it. Yeah. 100%. And that's the good point, right? If two decisions have enough appeal to compete with each other, you have to understand that both are as good as one another. So it literally doesn't matter. It's the same thing as a.
But once again, as you said, if one was objectively better, whatever that means, it's not there anymore. There's no appeal to it anymore because it's not real.
Yeah, it kind of goes into I don't know why I'm introducing this concept just to talk about it for way too long, but the concept of, we don't owe anything to future generations because they only exist. Those specific people will only be born because of the decisions we make right now, right? So
non-existence problem or whatever.
Yeah, like, if I were to summarize it very roughly, it would be like, we can mess up the environment because the people that were gonna be born if we didn't mess up the environment aren't even the same people because of the how consequences work. Aren't even the same people. So if the people that are born when the environment is gonna be messed up, they're gonna be okay. They deserve to have that because the only possibility of the circumstances of their birth is if the environment is messed up.
Right.
Which I hate this line of thinking.
Yeah, would they prefer being born in a bad environment or not existing?
Something like that. It's bizarre.
It's bizarre.
I don't like it, but
it feels sort of true, but it's counterintuitive and
it's like that. So it's like oh, even if you make a list of decisions and pick out the worst one, the moment the decision making process ends, that's kind of, you're gonna have to live with that. It doesn't matter anymore. Like, those other better decisions are as good as not even ever being available. And of course, the only counter argument to that is the reason to worry about past decisions is to constructively learn from them. But I feel like that's intuitive already. Like, it's instant. Stressing about past decisions is never going to help you learn more. You already know what you messed up the moment it happens. So, okay.
I think stressing is not going to help. Thinking about it may, right? But
Right,
yeah.
because thinking is an action and therefore can be achieved through one-pointedness of mind. Well, I realize why you were surprised and why I messed up by inverting the segments, but it's all good.
Yeah.
It's all good. Let's
Okay.
get to Tal Yarkoni's Generalizability Crisis.
Which is about psychology. Psychology catching some heat again. For the record, the criticisms I have of psychology are not to discredit the field as a whole. I'm going into that field, and so I just want to make it better as much as I can. But, you know, some of these arguments that we talk about are convincing to me. And so, you know, let's look for some ways to fix them, or we'll see. Generalizability crisis in psychology. Okay, so I think the way I want to introduce this is there's a well-known replication crisis in psychology, which is basically some studies done in the 20th century, or, you know, even in the 21st century, it doesn't matter, find some significant results, and some conclusions are drawn from that. Oh, this is the way a human works because this study found this. And then a couple years later, you know, a couple years, 10 years later, 20 years later, a test is redone, or that exact experiment is reproduced to the best of human capacity, and the same results are not found, simply. And it's called a replication crisis because what I just described happens a lot. Happens seemingly or presumably too much. And so I guess one way to look at the generalizability crisis is as a possible cause to the replication crisis, right? It contributes to the replication crisis. And the way to think about the generalizability crisis is just like this. A study, you know, an experiment is conducted, some results are found, and the scope of the results in reality are very narrow. What the results of the experiment show is that if the exact same experiment is done in the same time, environment, everything with the same conditions, this is what would happen.
Participants had the same sleep as the night before, stuff like that.
Exactly, this is what would happen. But what experimenters actually do is they generalize it to human life in general, and how they try to find applications in how we live everyday life. The reason that doesn't work is because studies are conducted under tight experimental conditions, which is required to single out one independent variable that affects the results of the study. So you go in a lab, you have an experimenter talking to you. I don't know, you're in a white room. Okay, maybe that's a hospital, not psychology experiments, but you're in a room without noise. There's a bunch of things that are completely eliminated. And the goal is to have one thing affect the results. And I think this gives the illusion that, oh, that's it, we've done our due diligence, and the results we find, mean something. But when you try to generalize them, it doesn't work. So do you want to say something, or I can bring the example he brings?
No, I mean, we could divide this conversation into the statistical problems, then the transferability of the statistics onto actual concepts, and then solutions. I feel like that would be a good divide.
The actual concepts. Okay, look, let's see if this resonates with you. Tell me if this.
Yeah.
Let me try to put words in your mouth. He talks about the Stroop effect. The Stroop effect is, I guess, kind of a classic psychological paradigm where you show a word, and the words are all names of colors. So red, blue, yellow, purple. And the letters themselves are of a certain color. And there are some trials where the color of the letters matches the word that is written. So red is written in red font. And there are some times where red is written in purple or yellow is written in green. And your job as a participant is to indicate when that happens, right? And
you just started talking like Andrew Huberman. Like explain like sometimes the letters R-E-D, red, are written in red, the color red.
And the Stroop effect. Wait, what is the Stroop effect? Is that it takes longer to I guess there's more mistakes and it takes longer to identify when it's not matching.
Yeah, there's a mismatch. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, exactly, yeah. And so the job of a psychologist when you do that study, what you want to do is model that effect in some way, right? And so you have a statistical model. And he describes, a primitive statistical model of it would be to say, there's a graph, there's a slope with reaction time or performance or whatever, and a certain constant describes the Stroop effect. And so the line sort of looks like this. And, some participants' result on this trial can be predicted. This is the goal after, right, too, is to predict the results of other people and to generalize it to other people. It can be predicted by this function, and we can say that their value is going to end here. But there's always some room for error, and so there's an error margin where the results could be within this margin. And you get that from doing your experiment. But the problem is that model doesn't consider, well, a lot of things, but first, differences between participants, right? No matter what task you do, there's going to be a difference in the performance of people. You can't just say, okay, this model applies to humans, because what affects your performance on this Stroop task, probably, IQ, short-term memory, reaction time, things that vary within people. And so a more advanced model would be to include error from participants, right? Or like there's another error that's added on, which makes the range of possible results larger. That's from differences between individual, and you have to consider that. It seems trivial that you have to consider that people are different, and not everyone. You can't make a model for all humans.
Right. So essentially, imagine you wanted to test the brightness of a room on performance on the Stroop task, right? Essentially, with the primitive models psychology is using now, to actually get an answer to the thing about the brightness of the room, you would have to...
The primitive one is not the one psychologists use. The one psychologists use is the one with the added error.
Right. Okay, so
yeah, the
primitive one, to get the actual answer, right? And it's not even the answer. We'll get to that later. It's really, does your statistical hypothesis have truth to it? With the primitive model, it would have to be the same person on every trial in the same building, essentially at the same time, with the same sleep, with the same researcher, saying the same things. So this is what the primitive model fits. This is what it takes into account in a way. This is all the variability it allows for. But this is not what psychologists use.
Yeah. Well,
you would think that it's a significant improvement to include the human variability.
Which it is. But the problem is that, as you just said, all these other factors also exist and are real and are not considered for some reason, right? You sort of include variability between participants, that error that error range, I guess, because you admit that participants are different, and if we didn't include that, we couldn't generalize across participants. The only thing that we could say is that what we found during our experiment with the participants that we did have is this, and it applies only to the participants that you had. And so you're like, okay, let's add an error margin because people differ, and it's possible that other people, and it's not possible, it's 100% true that other people will perform differently. So we have to add an error margin, which makes the range larger. But the thing is, well, what Tal Yarkoni says is that Psychologists do this for across participants, but they omit to do it across a lot of different other factors that also factor into the performance of the task, but are just not considered and that are generalized over in the discussion, right?
Yeah.
In the discussion, they say, what our study shows is that people, so that's maybe reasonable because they include the across participants thing, but they try to generalize in how people act in everyday life. When things like, okay, let's start with one thing. You have to add an error variance thing for different stimuli. So
look, just the way I can explain. Let me try to just do this, right? Imagine the situation that I told you at the beginning, right? It's a specific lab with a specific task with a specific researcher who has had the same sleep, the brightness of the room, the temperature of the room is all the same, okay? Imagine that 1,000 times. Just like expand that to a grid of happening 1,000 times, right? This is what a psychology study statistically is modeled for. Like, this is what it accounts for, okay? Now, that is absolutely not what happens, right? A psychology study is going to be done across, let's say, a month, so it's never going to be the same day, the same brightness, the same temperature, blah, blah. Now, obviously, in that situation, the primitive one, it's also modeled only for one person. So now, at least, psychologists include the variability between people. So you have to imagine that's the same situation across blah, blah, like I don't know how much time, but it's allowed to have different people. But everything it's not allowed to have, which are non-negligible factors that, have a big incidence on the actual variability and this validity of the results is, we could name anything, right? Temperature of that day, literally, how bright it was. Did they walk in the rain towards the laboratory? And you think,
and those are,
you want to dismiss those, right?
Yeah, those are small factors though that you just named. I think that maybe would affect the results on a particular task less. Although for other tests and for other experiments, that could be a factor that affects the results a lot. But mainly it's like the experimenter, when explaining the task, he's just a human, so he says different things to different people. The experimenter, sometimes it's one person, the next day it's another. And so what the first guy says is not necessarily what the second girl is going to say to her participants. And so the explanations that participants will get are different. Maybe they're going to understand it differently. It's going to affect them in some way. It likely will affect them in some way that changes their performance on the task. What about the stimuli themselves? So let's say the marshmallow study. And this is sort of what we were getting at during our marshmallow study discussion. So the kids are shown marshmallows, and then they need to delay gratification to get a second marshmallow later. And then we had a whole discussion about, but what about life? Life is not a marshmallow and then another marshmallow. What happens in real life is that you have to delay a donut forever because you want to lose weight.
Yeah.
But what happens is that they generalize it to real life and to delayed gratification, where the double the reward after is not promised.
Yeah, and like these things can't retroactively be calculated, right? Like if you're measuring how much red hue is in a light in the room on male aggressiveness, and then you do like the control, you do it with a woman experimenter, and then with a man experimenter on the red rooms, it might be the gender of the experimenter that affected it all, but when you actually read a psychology study, you're never going to have access to that information, so it's impossible. Now, being aware of those factors is fine, right? Like, we don't need to develop more. You understand that even the rain on that day, although negligible, could be a factor. Of course, the more important ones are what task is used, because it's also a wild assumption to think that, a video game and like a Pong, right? Like the first video game, just bouncing a ball back and forth with a virtual person. People easily, I know there's a study about trash talking, right? Just, provoking the enemy. People easily generalize such a thing to like a university sports competition, like university football.
Mm.
Their ultimate goal through this. So there's a study that has an experimental group where they give them a letter from another virtual competitor that says, "I will destroy you in this competition," and essentially they determine that it increases your competitiveness in that Pong game. And their ultimate goal is to transfer it to real life, right? To say, hey, don't trash talk your opponents before a sports game because that will increase their competitiveness. Be careful with that, right? But that transferability is wild to assume. But anyway, once you know, so the main things, right, would be kind of the laboratory setting. That's the big difference between experiments. The next step is just to know, okay, but how important is this? Because you're hearing rain before the experiment. What do you mean? How could this affect it? And Yarkoni says that it could comfortably go up to 60% false positive rates. Like, it's not a wild estimate that it could go up to 60, like around 60%. And a false positive is essentially when you confirm your hypothesis, but falsely so. So that's very important. Now, okay, I mean, I feel like we've kind of set that problem up pretty well. Then we can talk about construct validity, right? Which is essentially, so this is also a huge thing, right? So okay, we've talked about the statistical problems of how we test it. Now you have to realize the following, right? I've made this example a few times, right? Let's say you want to measure the result of giving a Mars bar versus your new chocolate bar on happiness levels. How, after thousands of years of philosophical debate on what happiness is, how are you, a mere psychologist, gonna tell me on paper in a few sentences, or a test, right? A circling test, or a Likert 7-point Likert scale, what happiness is? Is perceived happiness equal to real happiness? There's another question. So here he brings back an example about verbal overshadowing. Now, this is a study on 2,000 people in 31 different sites, I believe, of experiment, which tries to confirm a study, as you said in the beginning, from the 1990s about the existence of verbal overshadowing. Now, I don't think I understand why it's called such a fancy thing, but
oh yeah, okay. Well, verbal overshadowing is just let's look at it through an example. You hear a story with certain facts that you have to recall. It was a certain time of day, someone was going someplace, doing something, carrying something with something, and then your goal ultimately is to recall it. And so there are two conditions. Everyone hears the story. One group of people have to, name countries, like go through a list of countries unrelated to the story. The other group, at the same time that the control group is doing that, tries to, tell the story or say the facts in a minute, and just they re-say it. And then, 5 minutes later, the control is doing something unrelated. The experimental group tells the story again. They're retested. And what's found, retested in the sense that they have to recall the facts again and tell the facts to the experimenter from the story. What's found is that the people that sort of practiced, it's sort of counterintuitive, these results, but can be explained rationally. The people that practiced, the people that in the experimental group that said the story here, later, when they say it again, they make more mistakes than the people who, after hearing the story, only said the names of countries and then only recall them once at the test. And they perform better than the people who, practiced. I'm saying practice. I don't know if that qualifies.
So it's like a one-person broken telephone thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And the effect is explained by the verbal overshadowing effect. And so, mental processes are messy. encoding and recalling is messy, and so the reason people make more mistakes when they say it once and then have to say it again is that from the first time they heard the story, through all the encoding and recalling the first time, they made a couple mistakes already, right? Like they distorted the story, simplified it, maybe changed some facts, forgot something, added some parts on their own, and then that's the new story they're putting into encoding now. And the second time they recall it, it's even more distorted because the first time they already changed it, and then in all likelihood it's going to change even more when you're asked to test it. And the people in the control group don't go through that. They have sort of the raw story in their head still, and they only make, let's say, one layer of mistakes, right?
Allegedly. Because because essentially Yarkoni goes on the statistics of that study and includes even one of the like big gun factors that he could include in that model, and estimates how much more variability there would be if they did include, like, let's say he could include 3 that would really change these. And the importance of this study is that, look, in psychology, 2,000 participants, that is
Huge.
such a convincing study, like
Yeah.
beyond anything normal. And you would think that I think the conclusion of that study is specifically,
Oh, well, yeah, I
like,
guess.
oh,
Yeah.
without a doubt, or something, like, he used it as an expression like without a doubt, or overwhelming verbal overshadowing effect, right? So it confirms the findings from 1990s, but Yarkoni includes like one variability factor, which the important thing about this type of study is that it was done across 31 research sites, which, hey, giving him free
But I think we should say it because this is a big part of the criticism, is that I explained the verbal overshadowing effect by a story is told, but what they had is
a video, right?
a theft being committed,
Right.
right? And they see the face of the thief, and their task is to describe the face of the thief. And people that explain it one time later do it worse than the people that practice by naming country names and then just do it once. And you know, perhaps it could be generalized that if you know, in police investigations, when you ask someone multiple times, then the thing is distorted and something. But the big criticism is that, and a factor that isn't considered, is that across all those experiments, one video is shown of one face.
Yeah, exactly. And essentially, after including everything in the statistical model, even without having access to data, Yarkoni can essentially say, look, like,
I think he has. What do you mean without access to data?
without access to like the factors of variability that he would have if everyone did their due diligence and recorded them. That's what I mean. But essentially, he concludes that there is no way they could conclusively say anything.
Mhm.
And you have to understand that statistical significance, right? So for a psychologist to confidently say that something is, you know, found, you can have as little as 30 people in a sample, or at least in both conditions, right? 30 people,
30,
right? That's
yeah.
statistical significance.
Well,
2,000 people should, if an effect is real, right? Like ice cream sales and the crime rates, it should be overwhelmingly statistically like bulletproof. But essentially, Yarkoni includes the way he knows something must be modeled, and it disconfirms any certainty from that, right?
Yeah, what he says about that study, I messed up the explanation a bit, I guess. What he says the researcher should have said is that there is at least one particular video containing one particular face that, when followed by one particular lineup of faces, is more difficult for participants to identify if they previously verbally described the appearance of the target face than if they were asked to name countries and capitals.
Yeah.
Which is basically the conclusion that you can draw from that study.
Yeah, so essentially, okay? And I don't think, like, you know, obviously super ego me if needed, but I don't think I'm exaggerating here. If I were to do a study on handing out ice cream in warm weather, and after that somebody, like another researcher 2 minutes later intercepts the person and asks them to fill out a questionnaire about happiness, what I would like to name my study, if I do find an effect, is nice acts, random nice acts to people make people happy, right? That's reasonable. But what Yarkoni is saying is that these studies should never be this pretentious. It's extremely pretentious and statistically ignorant to say something like this if I do find a statistical effect. What I should actually say is that handing out blueberry popsicle sticks to, New York people between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. Is that how it works? Between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. on a 28 degrees Celsius summer day makes them circle higher scores on a happiness questionnaire, right? This is what is fair to say. And essentially, I think there's a great quote. Maybe if you can find it, it'd be cool. And he says about hot head, warm heart. So essentially, psychologists go for buzzwords and buzz titles that unfairly extrapolate what they've actually found. What you understand? Yeah, from the statistics of it, you understand this. Oh, and obviously, okay, statistics is one thing, right? He's good with that. But the logic of it, you have to understand that in psychology, we take things in life that actually exist, right? Like happiness levels. Then we encode them through language, very roughly. Then we make a verbal / statistical hypothesis that can be proven or disproven by data. So first of all, he said, well, there's a problem with the data gathering and data manipulation, first of all, right? As we've seen, the variability is much more extensive than is admitted by psychologists. But then, when you do find the positive effect, even if you were to use all this statistical, convoluted statistical analysis, you still have to understand that all you're proving is the hypothesis you made, not the extrapolation of that hypothesis to real life, right? So you just have to be careful about that.
Yeah, and I think the sort of counter argument to that is the concept of intelligence, right? What you're saying is that there's something out there in reality, and in the first place, when we try to characterize it, operationalizing a variable, right? Putting into words, first of all, putting into words some concept that we're talking about, like verbal overshadowing, whatever that is, or like working memory, like that we presume in naming it that way that's something that actually exists in our brain or in our mind or something. But I think what I think of first is intelligence, and like intelligence, we're doing that. We're saying, based on our intuition, there's something that improves performance on these things, and let's call that intuition. Let's call that intelligence. And the way to support and confirm a term like that is to check its validity. Does intelligence lead to the results we think it does? And I think intelligence is like one of the like the G factors, one of the most robustly supported things in psychology, because it correlates with like so many things, right? It correlates with life outcomes and performance on this, and it's so valid. Like it does actually it is found to affect so many things that we can say that it likely exists. But still, all we can say is that it likely exists.
What likely exists, right? What, like,
right?
I don't know. And
what you were talking about is, papers should be given titles like "Transient Manipulation of Self-Reported Anger Influences Small Hypothetical Charitable Donations," and not "Hot Head, Warm Heart. Anger Increases Economic Charity."
Right. And I'm sure, I don't remember that study, but I'm sure it was like, oh, we're going to pay you guys $10 for the hour you're here for the study, and you can give it to a children's charity. And then they manipulate how angry they are, but actually, ethically, they can't really make them angry for real. So it's probably like a small infuriating thing of like saying, okay, I'll bring you your water, and then not bring whatever,
Yeah.
So, okay, I mean, there are logical problems. Of course, one thing I didn't mention is once you make that kind of verbal hypothesis, you have to also look at, once your statistics confirm it, there are also multiple other verbal versions of a hypothesis that could exist, that could be the reason behind why your statistics are confirmed. So even the initial prediction you made isn't really... Anyway,
That's another criticism. It's the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, affirming the consequent in the sense that what you're saying is, if anyone's taken logic, I know some of our listeners have. Before the arrow of there's a consequent after, and before what is it?
Predicate. I don't know.
No, it isn't. But whatever. There's a name for it. Your hypothesis on your study is there, and the arrow you're drawing to is, this is my model of the world, or this is my model of this thing. And in confirming your hypothesis, you're saying, oh, this supports my view of the world or my view of this concept. But there's also, not infinitely, but there's also so many arrows going elsewhere that could confirm other worldviews. Your study does not only go into confirming your view of that concept. There's also other explanations by which the same result can be obtained with the same experiment.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, whatever your statistics say, you also have to realize that your initial experiment doesn't necessarily confirm what you think it confirms. So anyway, there are dangers everywhere. You should be hyper vigilant and extremely stressed. But
at all
that's
times.
not at all times. But that's not the point. Now, to be fair to Yarkoni, he spends like 3-4 pages, which is maybe, I don't know, 30% of the article, giving solutions.
Right.
So it's really cool.
Yeah.
No, he
well, the first one is
the first one is funny. The first one is very funny. But he genuinely entertains it, right? He says
it feels honest. It doesn't feel like he's mocking.
It feels like he wants to help.
Yeah,
for sure.
He's not mocking it.
But the first solution he gives is do something else
with your life.
With your life. So he says, well, he gets technical. He's like, okay, so if you're getting an undergrad, maybe consider switching to that. If you're pursuing a doctorate at the moment, maybe just like go in an adjacent field.
if you're a tenured professor, I can't really blame you if you want to keep doing what you're doing, and I can't expect you to change radically.
Oh, like he has humor sprinkled out throughout the article, but that's in that part. There's no humor. He's just like, okay, guys, I really want to help you, but so it's funny. So he says, yeah, burn psychology and leave it behind. He doesn't say that. So other things he says is be extremely specific in your predictions in a way where you're going to be right 100-fold less times, right? By order of magnitude. But when you're right, you're actually going to be able to claim you're right. So I'm just going to give the example he gives throughout the article. More. You can't ever say that you are right. But it's
Popper's right.
Yeah.
Popper's right.
But it's a guy who I think in the 1990s, he says, if I tell you it's gonna rain sometime next July, like the meteorological community is not gonna be impressed. If I tell you that it's gonna rain on Monday and Tuesday on some week of next July, they're gonna maybe notice me. But if I tell them how many millimeters at what time it's gonna rain next July and on what day, they're going to be impressed with me and they're going to notice me.
They're going to notice your model that you're putting forward, your theorization of the climate and how rain works. It seems it's almost undeniable that you've hit on something with your model.
Yeah, and that's the bigger thing, right? This is what I always say. Show me a psychology study that is surprising and convinces me of the opposite of my intuition. That's the thing, right? Like, either if it's surprising, I can just say, oh, okay, let them replicate it and maybe I'll listen. Then maybe I'll listen. But ultimately, all it is a non-risky thing. Like, trash talking makes you more competitive. So when there's more at stake, like, humiliation and ego, you're going to try harder at a competition. Okay. All right. So,
and he makes that argument regarding verbal overshadowing. Is that one of the other recommendations he makes? Is just a move more towards just qualitative psychology.
He does make that.
Yeah. So, as you said, sometimes you're like all the way down the path of like okay, all psychology research is useless, and why do we even do it? It just confirms what we already know. First of all, I think there's some value in confirming what we already know, and you have to have some scientific backing behind your theories, which you would agree to also, is like you can't just say stuff, and if you're wanting to apply it to society or to save someone's life or to something like important, you can't just say this is the way it is because I said that's the way it is. You have to have some science behind that, and that's the value behind it. But
or you could choose people that are right to say the things, like me, Dostoevsky, William James.
What?
Bodhidharma.
What?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so what he says is you can make the qualitative argument for verbal overshadowing, which we talked about earlier, and it's almost trivially true, almost self-explanatory. He says, mental encoding is messy, and we misremember things. Basically, what I went through earlier, right? The way I explained it earlier. I'm sure to the listeners at home, it made sense what I was saying, and you're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense." And then, if the study finds that result, what's the value of it if we know it already? As I said, the value of it is confirming it scientifically. But if, as Yarkoni claims, all the stats are messed up and all the claims are messed up, then you're not even proving it scientifically. You're not doing anything.
I've thought about it like this and explaining it in an email to someone. Think about the difference between what I can do in my head as mental calculation and a team of scientists can do with like a statistical software like R, right? Think about like the magnitude of difference, right? Now, instead of seeing qualitative psychology as me walking up to a playground and recording children interacting, although I'm banned from, but think about formed professionals who know how to observe. Like, think about how it could be scientized, right? And how they could come up with these, logical and trivially true theories based only off of their knowledge of the human mind and not, some non-robust statistics.
I think there's definitely some, not a good psychologist.
Like room for improvement, right? Like,
no, not a good psychologist. I forgot the term, but I think there's definitely in our minds right now the not the confirmation bias, the bias where after learning some results are true, you're like, oh, that's trivially true. I think that does apply to some things where the only reason we can say cockily and so confidently that that these things are trivially true is because the science actually confirms it. But
that's also a little bit unfair because I wish I was questioned on it before. That's the thing. Like every time,
you've said this many times. You want to write down predictions of how things are gonna go, and
I just don't want to go through the research of like knowing what researchers are interested right now. Like I don't really care. I actually don't care, but just to prove my point, I do care. So I may go through that.
Another thing I was thinking of though is imagine someone that knows the stats particularly well, knows the norms of psychology particularly well, and has bad intentions, or not even has bad intentions, has some biases that are very specific and lead that person towards a certain path, and they want to prove that. They will know how to set up their experiment exactly so that they can reduce the variability and have an experiment that's confirming their theory, sort of, but that theory is like it is not true, is shaped by their bias, and they're sort of confirming and going in a completely wrong way, and intuitively, you know what I'm saying? Like society changes and goes in a way where we want to prove theories that sort of serve some agenda, but intuitively don't make sense. And then when you try to revolt, I guess, against that qualitatively and say, look, intuitively that doesn't make sense. That's not how we think about humanity. And then they take their flawed experiments where the statistics do support their conclusions, but all these flaws that he's bringing up are so present. They could just say, "Oh no, look, the science proves it, and you're a horrible person because you're going against science irrationally, and your biases are leading you towards this." I can also see that happening.
Yeah, like the easiest way I could think about it is, again, like studying aggressiveness. And let's say, there are wilder things that have happened recently, even like a Harvard researcher literally like inputting data manually and faking data. But I know studies are supposed to be double blind, but let's say the researcher is actually aware of who's in the control, or maybe like that's randomized control trials that are double blind, like at a high level of like pharmacology, right? In psych, it sometimes like the researcher can know who's
It's a desirable model, but sometimes it's impossible. Yeah.
Right. So even the researcher, every time a person is in the treatment group and not the placebo, they could turn up the heat of the room, therefore increasing the aggressiveness, and then say that it's like all the data that it was truly really collected will reflect that it's whatever effect they want it to be. Let's say it could be like reading a certain book. Like if I want to prove that an author is evil and it increases aggressiveness, or you give 30 minutes for kids to game, like a violent video game, and you turn up the heat in the room. I could like manipulate the situation with things that are unrecordable in, like, who's going to record the temperature of a room in a video game study, right? I could make my theory come true.
And at the same time, like these sort of things are talked about by psychologists often, but I guess not enough. There are terms for this, like experimenter bias, where you come in and you expect a certain result, and that's why a double-blind study is desirable.
But that feels what I'm saying feels like a conspiracy theory type thing, where it may happen in 1% of cases where people are willing to cheat to get ahead. The real problem is the thing we don't know is happening. And the thing we don't know is happening has been talked about Yarkoni through the statistical biases and the logical, especially the logical transferability of, okay, I've concluded this thing.
Yeah, and so far I'm pretty convinced by the arguments, and I don't have enough statistical prowess to confirm for myself or deny what he's saying, but I hope I do, and I don't know, I'll see where this leads me. But this made me think, in behavioral neuroscience, there's an experiment that, in behavioral neuroscience, experiments on rats. There's an experiment on a rat, and there was an experimenter effect whether the researcher was a female or a male, because male rats acted differently while smelling the shirt of a female experimenter, because the pheromones, or across species, affected the rats. So it's just like, it's so hard to study psychology scientifically. It is hard. It's undeniably hard because so many factors affect it, and it's sort of blameworthy knowing these things to cheat and exclude some variability that you don't want to go through the trouble. But it is undeniably like hard. So many factors that we need to account for. It's very, very hard.
Yeah, imagine the last 3 years of studies that were done either with experimenters with masks on or online. Just parceling out, if that's the word, the effect of not seeing the experimenter's face on people's reaction is probably going to take like 5 to 6 years. Just understanding the difference and the validity of everything we've come up to. Anyway, so I think we've lined it out pretty well. The solutions are there, right? Just become writers, become good writers, instead of being psychologists. Figured it out?
Figured it out already?
8.
Yeah, I was going to say 8.
Okay.
Because I sort of stumbled in my explanation somewhat. Yeah, I sort of had an idea coming in of how I was going to explain it, but not totally.
You got verbal overshadowed. So I didn't really get that. Okay, well, thank you for listening. It's been the Thinking Bros. Contact us at thinkinbros@gmail.com and go on thinkinbros.com for more information on my blog, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.